Good morning. My name is Jaden doing this. Today is Saturday, January 9th, 2021. This is episode 8 of Join the Discourse. The premise of this show is to join the discourse. So a discourse is sort of a scholarly discussion. You usually need two or more people for a discussion, and that's where you come in. So if you'd like to join me, you can join the discourse by joining my Discord server. That's at jd-originals.com. You find it right on my homepage. Along with the stream, you can join if you have anything to say. You can stream your voice straight into this live stream if you'd like to. You can send me a message in there. You can also just DM or send me an email at jaden@jd-originals.com. I'll be on the lookout, and then you can join the conversation there. So today's topic is why the war on consciousness is a myth. Not only a myth, but it's a reinterpretation, like a redesigned version of the war on drugs, the war on black and brown people that's occurred in this country for the past war on drugs for the past 40 years, but the war on black and brown people, war for white supremacy, that's taken place over the past centuries and centuries, going on way back into our history. So I hear a lot of people talking about this war on consciousness. I see it a lot on like YouTube channels talking about it. I feel like Joe Rogan has probably talked about it at some point. And it's the idea that the government is working to criminalize drug use to prevent us from expanding our minds or something along those lines. There's probably a lot more to their ideas to that. But that's the pretty much the basis of it. And what that refers to is an interpretation of the war on drugs that is actually a war against all people instead of a war against black and brown people who have been the actual victims of the war on drugs for the past 40 years. Needless to say, I think it's pretty clear that mostly white people are saying that. And that's not to say this or that about white people or anything like that in the situation, but it's the fact that it's people who haven't held the experiences of black and brown people, the actual people who've been affected by the war on drugs. They haven't been affected. They haven't seen the effects of the war on drugs in a way that, people who understand the war on drugs came to understand the war on drugs, came to understand their position in society due to the war on drugs. And so, in my opinion, it's almost the equivalent of saying something like all lives matter. It's a way to discredit or at least to neglect the experiences of black and brown people who have been the true victims of this. And so the war on consciousness, that's one possible way of explaining these actions from the government. The war on drugs actions, mass incarceration, killing and incarcerating people for drug use and distribution. But it's not a thorough and complete explanation of that at all. So a more complete analysis might look like this. The war on black and brown people materialized as a war on plants and substances. That was just one way that it was able to manifest itself in order to have real life implications for these people. And so it's not a war against our minds. To some extent, I'm sure, the government, people who've put this stuff in place for the past years, decades, and centuries, I'm sure they know to some extent the power of drugs in a population. All right. So I'm not saying like that the war on consciousness is a total myth. There is some truth to the fact that drug use, specifically psychedelic drug use, could have some sort of altering effect on a society. But to a greater extent, they know the power of drug legislation and political power on a community. So more than they know the effect of drugs on a population, they know the effect of drug legislation on a community. And so nearly all substance legislation we have today, it stems from racist policies against black and brown people throughout history. And that includes legislation from the war on drugs, so in the modern era, as well as legislation, and not just legislation, but interactions that have occurred well into the past, our interactions with indigenous black and brown people around the world, in Africa and India and Asia and the Americas. And it's really a war on native people that's happening there. It's a war against indigenous people, and it's through industrialization that has occurred. Basically, that war on native people was the war on drugs before the war on drugs. And so now our substance legislation we have today comes from that war on native people, that industrialization that occurred. And it occurred through capitalizing these substances and using and abusing indigenous knowledge of the substances. And so in these cases of substance use and distribution legislation, the colonizers, the people who've implemented these legislations and these tactics of social control, they capitalize on the medicinal plants through two ways. So one is criminalization, and that is when you make a substance illegal, you prosecute the users and the distributors, and that has been the war on drugs. That's what we see today, but that started somewhere. So the other way, the way that it kind of started, is through commodification. And that's a capitalist principle. And so they take these substances, they figure out how to use them and manipulate them through other ways, either in laboratories or through taking indigenous knowledge of these substances. And then they commodify them into either, medicine. You can commodify medicine as we see today, the billions and billions of dollars that pharmaceutical companies rake in. But you can also commodify through abusing potency. And that creates commodified dangerous substances, what we call drugs. It takes humans to abuse that potency. And so it took, colonizers, it took people to abuse the potency of these substances, put these substances in communities, and then legislate around these substances as a form of social control. And so you think about heroin, it had a timeline that, brought heroin from first being an opium plant that was smoked to then being things like morphine, and then being further refined into heroin. And think of the impact of heroin on a community. Think about how devastating heroin has been to the Black community, also to the white community, also to Hispanic and Asian communities around the world. You think about alcohol. Wine and beer are a very organic sort of form of alcohol that we see in the world. And then we distill it into liquor, and think about all the alcoholism. I'm sure there'll always be alcoholism, even if there was only wine and beer in the world. But think about the levels of alcoholism we see now because of things like whiskey. You know what I mean? Like strong liquor, distilled liquor. That distillation process, that comes from humans. That comes from people abusing the potency and then commodifying it into something that can be sold. You think about was something we thought about recently, like weed carts, like those little things that they sell with the batteries, and they sell it in the smoke shops or whatever. Like, those aren't dangerously potent. Those aren't necessarily addictive, I guess, according to some like medical definitions of addiction. But that manufacturing process, it corrupted the nature of cannabis, which is something natural that doesn't kill people, that doesn't harm people in that sort of respect as people would typically think about drugs. And it corrupted into something that, killed young people it's still killing young people. People are still using those carts. And it's because of added chemicals that were part of a man-made product. And so through these examples, we can see that drugs, they're man-made, and they're dangerously potent most of the time, or at least they're just dangerous. Like those carts, that's ridiculous that was even a thing and is still a thing. But not just man-made. They're not just man-made. They're man-made to support the structure of white supremacy through one way or another. And so the knowledge of them is used to support the structure of white supremacy. It's taken from indigenous people and then it's propped up and used to commodify the drugs into something that supports the system and structure of white supremacy. Take powder cocaine, for example. The crystallization process of creating powder cocaine comes from indigenous people, comes from indigenous knowledge in the Americas. I think from Peruvian, I guess it wasn't called Peru back then, but like Peruvian indigenous people had held that knowledge and transferred it to explorers, colonizers. And then it was through that process that it was commodified, became a medicine, or at least in a food product. It was part of the Coca-Cola brand. Like how they have anything today is because they first were selling cocaine like in their products. And then crack cocaine was developed in a lab by federal grants, and it was used in the war on drugs to kill and incarcerate Black and brown people. So then it was used and created specifically to support white supremacy. It was used as a tactic of social control through the war on drugs and the war against indigenous people to try to rename that as a war against all people, or a war on consciousness is totally irresponsible because of the way that it was explicitly used to affect and to kill and incarcerate Black and brown people. And so that's all I've got for this episode. Before I head out, this is Join the Discourse. So if you got something to add, any questions, anything you want to discuss or like join the conversation with, you can join the conversation. You can join Discourse. You can find that at my homepage on jd-originals.com. You can find my Discord server there. You can also send me an email or a DM, like I mentioned, jaden@jd-originals.com, or on my social media. Remember, you can listen back on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube. You can play back on Periscope. I'm always there. You can also head to jd-originals.com for more than just Discord. I've got a lot of my past work on there. I've got my past YouTube videos, past live streams that I've done. I was just painting a live stream this week. You'll be able to see more live stream events in the future, as well as just more episodes. And you can find those all on my YouTube channel as well. But other than that, yeah, I'm gonna head out. Tune in. What day is it? So tune in Tuesday. I'll have another episode, probably something short. But other than that, thank you for watching.